My name is Kara St. Louis, and this morning I am in the company of a man who really has to be considered one of the most important geopolitical analysts who's working today. His name is William Engdahl. Do you use the F William Engdahl? I want to say that in case you're looking for his books, and you really should be looking for his books. Type in the F William Engdahl. And he's come here today to talk to me for Joe Conrad's Free Spirits TV show. Hi, William.
Hello,
so
Kara.
Nice to
Happy
have
to
you.
be here.
I have been looking forward to this for a very long time.
Well, thank
since
you.
the first time I saw you, which was on a show about 2 years ago in Germany. And I have had a chance to hear you speak about various things since then, particularly the Ukraine. It's madness, it's mayhem, it's unfortunately very recognizable to us, madness and mayhem in the Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
And it's becoming much more and more acute, the situation. And you really seem to have a handle on that based on your research. So can we start off by talking about what's going on there?
Sure. I think it's best to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved into all these national states, Ukraine, Russia, and so forth. And what didn't happen, the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance with Poland and the Soviet Union and company, that was dissolved immediately. The Communist Party was dissolved in Russia, etc., etc. The Russians entered into good faith negotiations about reducing the nuclear mutually assured destruction stockpiles between East and West. But something happened on the Washington side of the agenda. Washington didn't end the Cold War, they escalated it.
Right.
And what they did was they began modernizing the US nuclear strike force, and in violation of the solemn pledge that James Baker III had given to Gorbachev, who was then head of the Soviet Union, that is, Germany can be reunited, East and West, Communist East Germany, Western German state into one state, and NATO would not move east. That was the deal. And the Warsaw Pact would be dissolved. So there was no need for NATO at that point.
Right.
What happened is the US lied and reneged on the deal. They staged a putsch and got Yeltsin in, a man whose only requirement was to have a lifetime supply of vodka so he could stay constantly drunk, while his family looted everything lootable in Russia. Harvard came in with Jeffrey Sachs and shock therapy. The International Monetary Fund was made the control point for all the economic transformation, so they made sure that privatization was on the agenda, Chubais and company. And at that point, Russia was in no state to resist. They were just being savaged brutally. Well, end of the 90s, Putin became president, 99, around that time. And a nationalist faction began to try to stabilize the situation internally. They told the oligarchs who had done the looting and plundering and grabbed the crown jewels of Russia and stashed the money in offshore bank accounts in the West. They said, Putin made a deal with them, if you don't interfere in domestic Russian politics and repatriate part of your loot into rebuilding Russia, we'll declare a truce. So slowly Russia began getting on its feet, and people began working again, and the nominal functioning of a state. Well, in 2003, US government NGOs like the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, Open Society Institute of George Soros, the billionaire who always seems to be in the company of the State Department's regime change agenda situations. They financed something called the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And that brought in a guy named Viktor Yushchenko, whose wife had been an official in the Reagan administration State Department, was still an American citizen at the time Yushchenko was made the president of Ukraine.
I did not know that.
Oh, yeah. And the Yushchenko agenda was to bring Ukraine into the European Union and into NATO. Well, if you look at a map, at the same time, the same list of suspects, the same usual suspects in Washington, financed the Rose Revolution in neighboring Georgia, the Republic of Georgia.
Right.
Now you look at a map and you realize Russia is being encircled right up to the border of Moscow almost, with candidate countries to join NATO. And they tried very hard and failed to get Belarus, which is culturally very intimately a part of the Russian history.
Right.
Also, as part of this, that failed. The NGOs were outlawed in Belarus, which is a wise thing to do, I think, as they were later in Russia. But the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was a catastrophe. The Yushchenko mob that came into power in 2004 looted and pillaged Ukraine, and people got fed up with it. Finally, they voted in the candidate from eastern Ukraine, who was more disposed to deal with Moscow. Western Ukraine is historically part of Poland before the First World War, and the whole cultural thing is very different. So now, some years, 10 years later, after Yushchenko was forced out in an election that most Western election monitors declared to be a relatively fair election,
Right.
the U.S. decided to do a rerun of the Orange Revolution. And this began around the nominal issue of joining the European Union.
Right.
Well, Yanukovych entertained the options from the West, looked at them carefully, and decided to reject them in favor of a closer cooperation economically with the Eurasian Union project of Putin. And that was used by these NGOs that had been quietly working all over Ukraine for the last several years. That gave them the signal to start mass demonstrations, Twitter revolution a la Cairo and then Tahrir Square or you name it. And then the things got violent. Now, what wasn't reported in the Western media is that the violence was staged by the nominally pro-EU faction, by the Western forces. People were bussed in from Lviv in the west, which is the heart of Ukrainian fascism, really. It goes back to World War II and the Nazis, Hitler. They were pro-Hitler, anti-Soviet.
Right.
The devil in the deep blue sea, but that's their historical roots. And that has always been entrenched in Lviv, in that part, since World War II. They call themselves nationalists, but they're really Nazis. If you see their flag, you realize it gives chills up the spine. Black and red with a kind of a modified swastika.
Yeah.
So they came in, they created violence against the Ukrainian government riot police, and then the riot police reacted, and then that was used as a pretext to bus in thousands of youth, unemployed people and so forth, pay them a little bit so they come into Kiev. And this went on for about 3 months. Now, what was going on behind the scenes was a horse trading between Washington, a faction of the neoconservatives that are still entrenched in the Obama administration,
Right.
and the European Union, especially Angela Merkel in Germany. The Europeans had their choice candidates. Washington had their choice candidates. But in the end of the day, what it was a engineered coup d'etat from NATO
Right.
to have a duly elected government ousted, branded war criminals for incidents that were staged by the West. These were false flag incidents, if you want to call them that. And now Ukraine is in the hands of an illegitimate government. There's no constitutional process of Ukrainian constitution or law that recognizes them as legitimate.
Right.
it was a pure, it's like the Bolshevik Revolution in many ways of 1917. It was a putsch by a faction of the elite,
Right.
financed by, at that time, by the German General Staff and various others. And that's what we have in Ukraine today. Now, Russia is rightly reacting to that in fairly strong terms.
Sure, sure. And I can say, this show is meant for English-speaking audiences who are quite used to this recipe that you've just described, because we've grown up seeing this recipe enacted over and over and over.
The color revolution.
That's exactly it. And now it's gotten to the point where it goes so quickly that we don't even realize it's happening until it's happened. And so then it's happened, and we're left thinking about, okay, why in the world did they prefer the EU, which we at least know is crumbling. We at least have that much information that the EU is a bad idea versus Russia. I will say that this, when you were describing that, there were half a dozen things, points that were acutely interesting because we don't know a whole lot about him. I think the Americans are a bit dazzled by Putin right now. He seems like a very strong man, and maybe you can correct me if you have other information, but he's an interesting fella for us in the West because he appears to be fairly integrated. At least that's the impression that he gives, is he's very integrative. Obama's not going to be able to push him around. Obama's very dandified in a way, if you kind of have the impression of him. So these are two very different men trying to go head to head. So Putin is very interesting to us, number one. Number two is that I realized a couple of days ago from watching reports on the situation that things were happening, like the Ukrainians were raising the Russian flag. I had to ask questions about the history of Russia and the Ukraine. And this is something that we don't understand in the West either at all. And these things go so fast that we don't have a chance anymore to ask those kinds of questions. So maybe it would be useful to get a little bit more a little deeper into this idea of why the Ukrainians feel connected to Russia and why Russia feels connected to the Ukraine.
Well, if you have to go back to the time around World War I, before that, Western Ukraine was a part of Poland, the Polish Empire. Eastern Ukraine, Kiev Rus, that's the cultural heart of Russian culture, both in terms of the Orthodox Church religion, the language, and so forth. The eastern part of Ukraine is also the Donbass, where the oil and gas, the coal, the minerals, the industry of Ukraine is centered. It happens to be. The Crimea, this peninsula on the Black Sea, has been the location of the Russian fleet for more than 200 years, going to the time of the American Revolution, when the Russian fleet, Americans should dust up their history a little bit, the Russian fleet was one of the first, it was the first fleet to sail toward America and recognize the United States as a sovereign nation independent of Britain. So there's a little bit of history there that's important not to forget. Well, in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, for administrative reasons, gave Crimea administratively to what was called the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic of the Soviet Union, because it's all one union. And Russia, when Ukraine split off, Russia signed a treaty, a sovereign treaty. Crimea is an autonomous Republic of Crimea within Ukraine since 1954. The majority of the population of Crimea is Russian-speaking. There are about 250,000 Tatars who are primarily Muslim. There's a long bad history between Stalin and the Tatars and so forth, but leaving that aside. And the Russian fleet has been stationed, the Black Sea Fleet has been stationed in Sevastopol since the collapse of the Soviet Union, with a treaty arrangement and Russian citizens. It's allowed under the treaty to have 25,000 Russian soldiers on the Crimean Peninsula. So everything that's happened, which is being called the potential trigger for World War III, the new Cold War, etc., etc., is a very predictable response of Putin and Russia to what they rightly see as NATO staging a coup d'etat, installing a pro-NATO regime, shock therapy. The acting prime minister, or whatever you want to call him, is a darling of the International Monetary Fund and the economic shock therapy crowd. He's a leading member of Julia Tymoshenko's party. Julia Tymoshenko is, in a nation that's filled with political corruption, she's probably one of the top of the list of corrupt politicians.
Okay.
She has purely a media image with this strangely barbed hair that she...
Oh, is this the braid?
The braids, yeah, her
Yes.
braided hair.
Yes.
To create this image. And if you go back into German cultural history in the time of the Third Reich, Hitler, that was the look of an Aryan woman, the blonde braided
That's
hair.
the image, yeah, that's the image.
And so she very much plays to that image in the Western Ukraine, which is traditionally tied to these
So
roots.
what we're saying, and this I think is important for to say out loud for people, because these events are moving so quickly, and in the West we're not going to understand these things particularly, is that people raising the Russian flag in the Ukraine are just as likely to be Ukrainians as Russian soldiers, which will not be told to us. That will be presented, I predict, as Russian soldiers overtaking, helpless Ukrainians and raising the flag. That probably is not what's going on. They really do feel themselves to be Russian.
Well, they speak Russian. I have a dear friend living in Germany whose elderly mother lives in the Crimea, has a house there that he bought and paid for. Many Russians, ethnic Russians, settled in eastern Ukraine. The language is Russian. Now the new government is playing around with the idea of prohibiting Russian in the schools and allowing only Ukrainian, which is like two dialects of German, Hessisch versus Hanoverian Hochdeutsch. And different discriminatory things such as this. So the ultimate aim, I think, is for NATO to have missile defense, which is offensive in the extreme, stationed in Ukraine, seconds away from striking the missile sites of Russia itself, and creating a Washington nuclear primacy over Russia, the only nuclear power in the world that could resist a Pentagon nuclear attack. The only one. China is not
China's
prepared.
not there yet.
Without Russia, China is nuclear vulnerable.
And on the other side of this, because I think we should probably talk about that a little bit, based on just coming from a standard Western viewpoint, we're buried in alphabet soup in the in the West. NATO, the EU, the IMF. It reduces our ability to understand with any depth what we're talking about here, and even NATO, which has been around in our memories, quote unquote, forever. I think we've lost sight of what NATO actually is, and NATO does a lot of damage in the world. On our behalf.
Well, the interesting thing is when the Soviet Union dissolved and the Warsaw Pact dissolved, why in the world did we not dissolve NATO in the 90s?
That's a good question.
When it was clear that the Russian economy was in no shape or form to launch anything against the West. They didn't want to. They wanted Western standard of living. They wanted modernization of their collapsed economy, they wanted technology, they wanted good life for their kids and so forth.
Right.
They didn't want war. They were fed up with that. That's why they threw in the white towel of surrender. And what did we do? We expanded NATO right up to the door of Moscow. Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, etc., etc., etc. Now they want to do that with Ukraine, bring Ukraine into NATO, and with Georgia, bring Georgia into NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the name of NATO, but today we don't use that name because it's not about defending the North Atlantic. NATO troops are in Afghanistan. That's pretty far from the Atlantic in my geography.
Right.
So this is more or less, we're seeing a global military force controlled ultimately by Washington, by certain military circles in the US, The neoconservatives are the altar boys for this military-industrial complex, the same complex that Eisenhower warned about in his farewell speech in 1961.
Sure.
Well, they have now become a multi-trillion-dollar enterprise globally that tramples over nations, that has largely destroyed the substance and fiber of the United States of America and the American people with these insane wars, Afghanistan, then Iraq, and then Libya, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The list is almost endless. And now Ukraine.
Right.
So what is this? Is this the new Sparta, where America, the United States of America, plays the role of the Spartan state, the military launch pad, the cannon fodder, whose sons and daughters are sent off to commit atrocities around the world and be loved for it because it's called democracy? It's a little bit cynical.
I think Americans are waking up to that, finally. However, things are moving so quickly that it's hard for them to get a purchase on anything, which I think is why it might be important to start with, okay, let's have a look at NATO, because we're always right behind this spearhead called NATO, and we don't even know what it means anymore or what it's for. And you mentioned the IMF in concert with NATO. Is this they're holding hands everywhere they go?
Hand in glove, and it's controlled at the top. The same elites control both, and they act in a coordinated fashion. If you follow the history of the color revolution since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, then you see that it's a very much coordinated action. They come in and force countries. Now they're doing it in Western Europe, in Greece and Portugal, places like this. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is part of the 1944 Bretton Woods Treaty Agreement between Europe and the United States. Now it's become the global financial cop that dictates to nations how they prepare their national economies for globalization. Well, globalization is nothing more than the global control of 147, it's been estimated, global corporations that control the vast material wealth of the entire world. And at the top of this pyramid of 147, in a research analysis done by ETH in Zurich, Switzerland, are the main financial institutions of the United States and Great Britain. Banks like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, State Street Bank in Boston, which is an investment fund more than a bank, and Fidelity, Magellan, the big mutual funds, that's historically based in Boston. They control the shares of the corporations that are part of the 147, Monsanto, ExxonMobil, Raytheon, Boeing, and so forth. And it's all a pyramid. And this private power, Mussolini called his system, it's known in the West as fascism, but he personally preferred the term corporativism because it was the domination of electoral politics, government, by these giant corporations, the banks of Italy, the steel barons, and so forth. And that is what we're seeing on a global scale today. So it's not the American people that are behind this. Most Americans I know are without a clue of how their world has been destroyed over the last 30, 40 years.
That's right. They have no idea.
People old enough like myself with the memory of how things used to function in the 50s or the 60s don't recognize the United States anymore.
Exactly.
So it's not that this is an evil American people that's out to destroy the world. Most Americans, if they realize what's being done, are horrified.
They are, yes, indeed. So really quickly, because I want to be able to have time to move on to China, which is another one of your wonderful specialties. Back to the alphabet soup. We've got NATO, we've got the IMF, and they're using the EU, which is their monkey wrench, to vandalize what's left of the continent. It's not. You couldn't really call that Europe, could you? That's Eurasia. You'll correct me, I hope. So we have a faction that somehow has not necessarily managed to convince the Ukrainians that joining the EU is somehow better than, I mean, it's a little bit complicated, than holding hands with Russia again. But what are they, do you have some idea of what the argument is to convince the Ukrainians who are in favor of going to the EU?
Most Ukrainians, I've been told from people in Ukraine and with extensive contacts in Ukraine, most Ukrainians are not at all enchanted by the idea of the EU,
right,
except to have a better life standard, less corruption, and so forth. But the sequence is interesting. There is a fault line between the politicians of the EU and that of Washington. The tape that was released on YouTube about 3.5, 4 weeks ago with the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who is a well-known neoconservative. She's a hawk who used to be the assistant to Dick Cheney, who's not exactly known as a peace-loving gentleman. She then became U.S. ambassador to NATO under George W. Bush. Then, through Hillary Clinton, she managed to slip back into the State Department as Hillary Clinton's spokesperson, and now she's the Assistant Secretary responsible for Europe. Well, 3.5 weeks ago, there was a scandalous telephone intercept of Nuland in Kiev speaking with the U.S. ambassador. And in that tape, she outlined exactly who she, this neoconservative ex-aide of Dick Cheney, wanted in the government, a government that wasn't elected.
Right.
She was dictating. And who she wanted of the three opposition parties to the government, who she wanted on the outside. One was the head of Svoboda, which is a extreme right-wing party connected to Nazi groups in the Western Ukraine. And that was a little bit hard tobacco to market in the U.S. And Klitschko, the boxer.
Right.
So then she said, I know the EU wants Klitschko in. Well, Klitschko lived for 10 years in Germany, so he has strong German ties. And she made this famous quote with the F word, F the EU.
Right.
And at that point, the entire U.S. charade was exposed to the world.
Yeah.
They didn't deny it, they just simply blamed Putin for wiretapping them. Well, the NSA does a little bit of that themselves, I believe. I've heard something about that.
There's a rumor.
Yeah, there's a rumor going around. But when somebody else does it, it's a dirty pool.
That's a problem, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so 2 weeks later, the European Union, the foreign ministers of Germany, Steinmeier, the foreign minister of Poland, Sikorski, and the foreign minister of France, went to Kiev, and they sat down with all three opposition party leaders and with the president, with the elected government, and in a period of 2 days they hammered out a compromise. It was presented to the demonstrators that had occupied central Ukraine. They voted yes. It looked like a diplomatic solution had been achieved. One thing that wasn't generally discussed in the US and the Western media is there was one party that was deliberately not invited, and that was the United States. Well, within 12 hours, all hell broke loose. Snipers, professional snipers, began shooting on the crowd, and the deal was off. Well, the professional snipers are connected with NATO.
Sure.
And the balance of the evidence leads me to conclude or to believe that Victoria Nuland and company ordered the snipers to sabotage this European agreement.
Right.
So there are huge fault lines between Europe and the US, but the Europeans are weak.
Yes.
When the Europe 20 years ago wanted to build up the Maastricht Treaty with the central bank, the euro, and so forth, there was a section of the Maastricht Treaty of 1993, 94, in that period, which calls for a European defense pillar. This is generally not known.
No, it's not. I've never heard of it.
Well, it's in there.
Yeah.
And the idea was that Europe should have its own defense independent of NATO. Well, isn't that cute? NATO is always controlled by a SACEUR who's an American.
Yeah.
and Supreme Allied Commando since Dwight Eisenhower and company. So that was sabotaged by Washington. Said, no, you're not allowed to be independent in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So Europe is between the devil and the deep blue sea, and yet Germany knows this. Many European countries are aware of this. The economic future of Europe does not lie in Europe, and it no longer lies in the Atlantic Alliance with North America, because that's going down the tubes economically. It lies in Eurasia, which is the European-Asia land space that encompasses Europe, Germany, Poland, that whole space, France, Italy, and Russia, China, and Central Asia.
Yeah. Yeah.
Down to the Middle East, down to Iran and the oil-rich countries of the Middle East.
Which makes it important that we all get on board and get up to speed with a lot of things that we have not been, information that we have not been privy to in any way, shape, or form. In every level of the cultural arena in Eurasia, we've all been sort of sequestered in our own little continents. We don't know what's going on. You've done a lot of work on China. You've done 2 books worth of work on China. I want to show them now. First, this is the first one, yeah?
That's Seeds of Destruction. That's actually on the dark side of genetic manipulation.
But it goes to China, yeah?
Yeah, it deals with China.
Which is good because it gives us an opportunity, I hope we have time, it gives us an opportunity to talk about the other ways in which the West manipulates countries, these more insidious tools of war that we use, and we use them all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And this one, which...
The English is about to come out under the title Target China.
Target China. Very, very important that we start to get a handle on this as well, because China is coming into the fray. Yeah.
Oh, they're
in a big way. They're in the fray in a big way. So we need to know that. This morning I was looking at the headlines, and Der Spiegel, take that for whatever it is. Der Spiegel had the headline, China announces massive rearmament. Okay, obviously Der Spiegel's not going to report this accidentally on the heels of what's going on in the Ukraine and all of the terror mongering that's going on toward Westerners toward Russia, trying to get us all ramped up again about Russia. As a bogeyman. So let's talk about that, because you're uniquely qualified to talk about how China plays into this now.
Well, the first foreign visit of the newly designated Chinese President Xi 2 years ago was not to Washington as it had been for his predecessors.
Yeah.
It was to Moscow to meet with Putin, to emphasize the closeness of the strategic partnership between China and Russia.
Yeah.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's a geopolitical strategist, the architect of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1979 with Jimmy Carter when he was National Security Advisor. Brzezinski is a defender of, if you want to call it, the American empire, American sole hegemony, to his dying bones. He's now in his mid-80s, I think. And he wrote a book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard. It was about Eurasia. And he said the only part of the globe that could be a potential threat to the sole domination of the United States is Eurasia. If the countries of Eurasia, China, Russia, the Central Asia, and so ever become united, the game is over for America as the sole dictator of what other countries will do.
Right.
Meaning Brzezinski's friends, like Henry Kissinger and so on. Well, the Chinese, I've been to China now 10 times over the past 6 years. And I've traveled extensively through China, been invited to universities or to various think tanks, or in some cases the Ministry of Science and Technology conferences and so. I've spoken with students, I've spoken with professors, extensive discussions with all levels of Chinese culture and society, from taxi drivers through interpreters and so forth. And what they've done with their diligence, their hard working and so forth, I make a joke with my Chinese publisher that you Chinese are 24/7, you don't stop. We finish a series of meetings at 10 o'clock in the evening, and he said, now you have a time to rest, I'll be knocking on your door at 7 a.m. And that's how every single day there's because they have such energy to transform their country. But what they realized around 2008, the first time I was there, is they had gotten involved in a Western economic model that was becoming very, very dangerous for China.
Yeah.
They were losing the essence of Chinese culture, the essence of Chinese food security.
Yes.
You go downtown Beijing and you see on every second corner KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is all GMO chicken, GMO-fed chicken. You see McDonald's, which is GMO soybean burgers, and so forth. The young Chinese kids love this garbage peddled as food. And the traditional Chinese food culture, I realized over the period of 5-6 years in many visits, even to Sichuan province, to Yunnan province in the south, and so it's becoming more agribusiness, industrialized, standardized packaged foods. And that's a tragedy because the Chinese food culture is higher than any food culture, including the French and Italian, that I've seen in 28 some years living in Europe, and certainly higher than most North American food culture.
Well, it's absolutely stunning because the Chinese strength of their culture is what saved them for millennia. So that's just a testament to the power of the psychological warfare that's going along with this food infiltration,
And then the more deeply I got involved, my book was published at the end of 2008 called Seeds of Destruction. I was asked for interviews when I went there to announce the launch. I was asked for interviews by the leading newspapers in China, or I think I did 20 interviews in the space of a week. And they all got copies of the book. Well, about a year later, the Prime Minister of China announced that a Chinese company had been given license to commercialize Chinese GMO rice. Well, there was an uproar in the Chinese communist-controlled state media. This is something for us in the West to think about.
It is.
An uproar against their own government, their own communist government, quote unquote. And they quoted Seeds of Destruction, my book, as an argument against why China should allow this, why the government should allow it. So there was a huge outcry against GMO, and it's partly was seeded by the fact they were made aware of this through a book from the West, from myself, that led them to begin looking into this whole question of GMO and not blindly accepting anything from the West as superior to the Chinese. Well, that process has been going on now for 5 or 6 years. And the Target China book that you mentioned was launched a year ago, January in 2013. Since then, it's sold more than 60,000 copies. And I've been told by Chinese friends that it's become a hotly debated topic in the Chinese intelligentsia and universities and the government and so forth. Can this really be true? Is it the case that the West promoting vaccination of Chinese babies is actually promoting the chemical poisoning of Chinese people, maybe even worse? Can it be that the importing of 60% of the soybeans consumed in China is GMO, and that's not doing any good to the health of Chinese animals or humans? And it's stirring an intense debate about what the real motives are of their once considered friends in America. They're realizing the round eyes, as the Asians call them. The round eyes are double-crossing us or cheating us.
Well, you know what that makes me wonder, William, because you talk about the Orange Revolution. I mean, there's really a package that gets launched on people. What's this package? What does it include? Have we thought about that yet? It's GMOs, it's vaccines.
It's GMOs, it's vaccines, it's currency control. Letting Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and so have a level playing field with Chinese state banks. The renminbi is not yet fully convertible as the dollar is or as the euro is. So the IMF in the West is pushing for convertibility. The Chinese are taking their good time about that. They're building up their gold reserves in the central bank so that it'll have credibility as a serious currency when they're ready for that. But they're not jumping into it pell-mell as some of their Western advisors urge them. Which I think is very wise. The longer you have control of your own banking system, your own credit issuance, the longer you have control of your own sovereignty. The United States of America gave up that sovereignty. The Congress of the U.S. gave it up in 1913 December, when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act to give the control of the issuance of currency of the United States of America to a cartel of private banks led by Wall Street. So all of these things, the Chinese had never, or leading Chinese intellectuals and responsibles had never thought of this as a coherent offensive of a faction in the West that wants to control the sovereignty of China as they do with Russia, or tried with Russia up to a point in the 90s. And that's the template. It's called globalization.
Yes, and I think that there are people in the United States, and it's not particularly safe avenue of occupation in the United States, that are trying to put all that together so that Americans can actually understand that. This particular thing that started essentially in 1913. It really only matters from 1913 to now, because that's the package, that's the gun that's being aimed at everybody, including us in America. So what do you think? I'm sure China is rearming. I'm sure China is rattling their saber a little bit.
Mad if they wouldn't.
On the side of what? Why do you think they're?
Well, let's go back a couple of years to Obama's visit to Australia, where he announced the Asia pivot, as he called it. It's really the China pivot, as I explain in the book. And what that was a redeployment of the Pentagon, the awesome military arsenal of the United States, into Australia, into Japan with missile defense aimed at China, of course, into South Korea, into the Philippines, into Indonesia, essentially encircling China. And using surrogates like Abe's government in Japan. Abe is very close to Dick Cheney's people in Washington. He's being groomed by John McCain, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy's Republican Institute, the chairman of that. Every time there's a color revolution, this goofball Vietnam veteran who faked his prison conditions, McCain ends up in the limelight. A more dishonest American politician, you'd have to scrape the bottom of the barrel.
He really would. Maybe Rumsfeld, but
maybe.
But that's my opinion, not his.
Okay. It'd be a hard one for me to come up with an answer. In any case, so the Japanese are now talking about remilitarizing the Japanese military defense posture for the first time since World War II, aimed at China. And this whole pivot out of the Middle East into Asia is clearly creating some considerable unrest in Beijing.
Yeah, it's interesting that they see the Ukraine as where they're going to, seemingly, perhaps where they're going to draw the line in the sand, in a way.
Well, actually, the line in the sand was drawn in Libya. Well, not in Libya, after Libya, in Syria.
Okay, let's talk about that.
And that's when China and Russia, two of the 5 permanent Security Council members of the United Nations, vetoed every attempt by Susan Rice and the Obama Warhawk faction and the British and the other members of the Security Council to create a pretext for a military action in Syria, similar to that they did in Libya. That didn't function because of the united front that China and Russia made in the Security Council. That was really the first line in the sand, and the entire destabilization of Assad in Syria fell apart. Then the fault lines began multiplying. You had a split between the Saudis and Obama administration because Obama was backing the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere. The Saudis hosted the Muslim Brotherhood when they were driven out of Egypt in the 50s. The CIA brought them into Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi monarchy began increasingly to distrust the brothers. So they went into Qatar, which was financing the revolution in Syria, or the attempt to oust Assad. And that forced an alliance, I call it the Iron Triangle sometimes, between Tehran, i.e. Iran, Russia, and China, to draw the line with Syria. No further, no more of these color revolutions.
You know what was really interesting for me, just as an aside, as a bystander, spectator, basically, was that in a world where people do what the United States tells them to do, the Western countries, they all stood down over Syria. Germany said no. I mean, I don't know the details, but this is on the face of it. It looks like England said no, and Germany said no, despite the fact that the U.S. said yes. Okay, that doesn't often happen.
Doesn't often happen. And
so,
the background is interesting, Cara. There are factions in Washington. They're very high-level factions, very powerful factions, and it's not all black.
Yeah.
And that gives reason for hope for the future of the United States and the world, really. And some of those factions, I've been told, are in the highest ranks of the military establishment, the professional soldiers. And they have realized they have been lied to by the politicians. They've been lied to by Henry Kissinger. They've been lied to by Brzezinski. They've been lied to by Robert Gates. They've been lied to by Leon Panetta, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on the question of war in Syria, they said this requires boots on the ground, mega boots on the ground, and we are prepared to resign if it comes to that.
Right.
Well, let's go back to September of 2013. Unfortunately, Obama made a stupid statement that allowed him to be painted into a corner when he said a year before that, in 2012, if Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons on his people, that defines a red line.
Yes.
Well, the neocon faction in Washington and Bandar Bush, the head of Saudi intelligence today, who was put in there by the king to deal with the Syria problem, basically. Bandar Bush he's called Bandar Bush by George W. Bush because he's so close to the Bush family after 23 years as Saudi ambassador in Washington. Now he's the head of Saudi intelligence. Well, Bandar Bush made alliances with something called AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Council, the chief lobby of the Israeli intelligence, the Likud party in Washington. They lobby Congress, they do all sorts of things that ought to be illegal as foreign interference.
It is illegal.
But they have little loopholes. Okay, so here you have Saudis that are supposed to be the archenemy of Israel, and the chief lobby in Washington of Netanyahu and the Likud, the right wing, in an unholy alliance to topple Assad in Syria. This came out in the course of the summer. Well, there was allegations of use of sarin gas and chemical weapons north of Damascus in late August, early September last year. And immediately the propaganda mills went out that this was Assad gassing his own people, something the height of lunacy, because of course he knows that Obama said this a year ago, that would be the red line. Suddenly Obama found himself painted into a neoconservative corner. The President of the United States has to stand up and back his words with military might, or he's impotent. And, you know, it was an impossible situation. Well, what came out, some Jordanian journalists went into the site of the alleged chemical weapon attacks, interviewed families whose sons had died in that, and they got the information that the chemicals were brought in by none other than Prince Sultan Bandar bin Sudan, Bandar Bush, from Saudi Arabian intelligence, and they'd been given to these terrorists called opposition forces inside to create the false flag incident that would be used to push Obama into war. Obama was informed by some people I'm in touch with, patriotic Americans, well-meaning Americans who don't want war. Obama was informed, Kerry was informed, Secretary of Defense was informed, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs was informed. This is a false flag, we're being duped. And at that moment, Putin made the offer to mediate a diplomatic solution, and Obama grabbed onto it like a lifeboat in the sinking ship. Thank the Lord, that probably prevented World War III. So it's extremely complex. Obama's in a weak position. I don't demonize Obama. Every president since the assassination of Lincoln has either played with the sheets of music that are given to him by Wall Street or the military industry or the powerful interest groups, or something happens untoward, like what happened to Jack Kennedy when he tried to wind down the war in Vietnam and go against the military industry and the CIA.
Right.
So Obama, of course, knows this. He's beholden to them for his re-election, but now he's in a position where he cannot be re-elected, and certain people around him are, I think, genuinely trying, in the best interest of America, to defang this monster that's been built up since 9/11, 2001.
I think you're right. That flies under the radar, though, because that flies under the radar because it doesn't serve the interests of the people who are doing these really fast attacks to get what they want. So you're saying, let me reiterate a little bit so I make sure I understand. You're saying that because Putin negotiated a stand down that allowed Germany and England and the rest of the world to say no to the United States in a situation where they ordinarily would not say no. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the British Parliament said no to Cameron.
Right. Wasn't that interesting?
Yeah. And that kind of upset Cameron, who's an Atlanticist par excellence, like Tony Blair was before him.
Right.
And it doesn't have anything to do with party, conservative or Labor.
Right.
Same as with Democrat, Republican in Washington. But, excuse me, I think Obama was clearly looking for a face-saving way out, and Putin gave it to him.
Right.
So suddenly, the man that Obama 2 weeks before refused to even sit down with at the St. Petersburg summit of G8, because there was hostility over the Snowden affair and ostensibly all these other things, suddenly saved the skin of the President of the United States. So it's a very complex situation right now.
And of course, this is something that people don't know. No one knows that Putin, I mean, that's not general knowledge that sort of diplomacy happened, right? And have we seen anything from the United States that's been anything less than hostile toward Putin post? I mean, we really haven't, have we? It's really just the status quo. And you know what, William, I was thinking, because issues of personal sovereignty are very important right now. And they're, I think, more important right now because issues of national sovereignty feel very hopeless in a way. And so pulling it into... They
shouldn't be hopeless,
They shouldn't be, no. But, and so when I think about the situation in the Ukraine, I try very hard right now to think about the people who are living there. Do they have any power to change the situation, do you think?
All these protests in the middle of Kiev and other cities were staged.
Right.
They were orchestrated. Hollywood, you know, the NGOs, the political human rights NGOs, the same cast of characters that have done all these destabilizations under the name of human rights, democracy. Most Ukrainians stayed in their homes. They wanted to go to work. They wanted to support their families. They wanted to have a stable life, you know, after 20 years of this chaos and looting. They didn't want another color revolution. So it was a tiny handful that was played up in CNN, BBC, the Western usual suspect media, to create this idea of this massive protest against the elected government. That wasn't the case. Most Ukrainians, the majority of them in eastern Ukraine, feel culturally Russian. It's just one culture, one language. So the idea that this deep bitterness exists is really manipulated.
And isn't this is part of the whole package? The populations involved are exhausted. Americans are exhausted. They're exhausted very much on purpose by all of the stuff that's been thrown at us, particularly since 9/11. Constant, unrelenting fear, panic, terrorism, just over and over and over and over and over in every way, every visual and oral way that you can think of. It exhausts populations. So we're talking about, I suppose, when you're saying these things, I'm thinking of a population in the Ukraine that's just exhausted.
They're exhausted and they're full of fear. They don't know what's going to happen. They're, well, I know this from first-hand accounts, they're terrified. Do
you have any thoughts about how these things unravel once they get started? How these things, I mean, because we really aren't, even though we have these scenarios that are very well oiled in how to cause all this to start, are there any scenarios that are emerging, and how to untangle these messes and restore countries?
Well, let's take Ukraine. Now there's been a non-elected government that's created a putsch, a coup d'etat, and they've selected their own people as dictated by Victoria Nuland and the State Department and etc., NATO. The real power right now in Kiev is held by to call them right-wing is to be generous to them. Their heritage goes back to the Nazi era in World War II, when a group in Western Ukraine fought together with the Gestapo, with the SS, killing Jews, killing Russians, you know, Soviet soldiers, Red Army soldiers, and their descendants, their children and grandchildren, come from Western Ukraine, which used to be part of Poland before World War I, in Lviv and elsewhere. And that, historically, right up to the present, has been the center of neo-Nazism in Ukraine. And there's some really ugly skinheads are mild compared to these guys. Well, NATO picked these guys up. Their fathers were brought over at the end of World War II, like many Nazi scientists and Nazi doctors, and so the CIA, or the predecessor of the CIA, the OSS, managed to get a number of these key Ukrainian Nazis into the United States. Demyanyuk is one name that maybe Americans and people in the West have heard. These war criminals were brought to the United States and cultivated by the CIA as anti-Soviet weapons. So these networks have been cultivated for nigh on to 60-some years by Western intelligence, by NATO. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in '91, they started building these assets up again.
So it's like this is kind of a theme that is emerging, I think, right now. These things are so deeply entrenched and so well oiled and have been going on for so long through generations of people who can't separate these things from things that are not these things, that we're almost in a situation now where either the choice is to decide to live with whatever these entities work out for us, or to hit the reset button. And I think what's happening is this is the subterranean world that's developing in terms of communication, in terms of art, in terms of education or non-education, in terms, what does that actually mean and how does that have to happen? And communications and how we live our lives. It's kind of interesting, I think, that it might be the only solution is this underground world that's...
I wouldn't call it underground, well, maybe subsurface. Subsurface
world that's weaving itself together as a fabric. Because people, I think, perhaps are at a point where they realize they can't undo this overarching...
Well, they can. That's, I'm convinced of that. That's what motivates me to do the work I'm doing. There are two extremes. I say this often in my talks. There are two extremes of emotion that human beings have. Fear on the one extreme and love on the other extreme. And this is not the wishy-washy Hollywood romantic love and da-da-da hearts and Valentine's Day and so. This is human love for what's sacred in human beings. And essentially, we're all more or less born with the quality of loving and being loved. Then things get messy. Then wars happen. Then children's lives get destroyed. They get mutilated. They get raped and abused. They get see their parents killed before them in various wars. And these leave cultural scars, traumas that go for generations, for centuries in some cases. You could trace it back to the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, Catholic against Protestant, to expunge the heresy of Protestantism by either conversion, baptism, or by murder.
Yeah, it is a human paradigm, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you're saying, and I agree with you completely, that love, as long as we're operating from that heart-mind love arena, we have the power to do whatever we want to do.
That's the point. We forget that.
Yeah, we do forget that. And that is that's the stream that's running through many people's work right now all over the world, that we, each of us individually, already have what we need to stop it right now. I wish I could talk to you for another hour, but I cannot. And so I'm going to have to find a way to talk to you again soon. But
Okay.
thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming and talking.
Well, thank you,
today.
Cara.
Yeah.